Hello, everybody, and welcome to End of Life University podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, hospice physician and author. And on this podcast, we share real talk about life and death. Today is episode number 207, and I will be doing a solo episode today. This will be part 2 of the series, The Dance of Life and Death. And today I'll be talking about balance. But before we get to that, I have a few other announcements to make. First of all, I'd like to thank my latest supporter on Patreon, Heather Thomas. I really appreciate you joining the team and becoming one of my patrons. I will talk a little bit more about Patreon after the feature episode for today, so you can stay tuned and listen. But if you're curious, you can go to Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU and learn a little bit more about it. I'd also like to just remind you quickly that I will be in New York City, September 6th and 7th. On Friday the 6th, I'll be doing the Art of Dying author series, talking about my book, What Really Matters, and doing a book signing. And Saturday the 7th, I'll be doing an all-day workshop called Earth Lessons for the Soul, Transcending the Difficulties of Life. So if you're in the New York area, I hope you can join me at the Art of Dying Institute, which will be at the Open Center in New York City, and come to the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com. Look for episode number 207, and I'll have links to those two events at the Open Center in New York on the show notes page. So before I get started talking a little bit about this subject, the dance of life and death, and particularly balance and how it applies to the dance, I just wanted to mention I'm going to post a link to a blog I wrote in the past called How to Cope When Tragedy Strikes. And this is because over the past 10 days or so, we have been just rocked here in the U.S. by 3 different mass shootings that have taken place. And it's interesting, I looked back at this blog, How to Cope When Tragedy Strikes, which I originally wrote after the Sandy Hook massacre. That was back in 2012. And I have actually rewritten the blog multiple times for multiple other mass shootings that have taken place. And this past couple of weeks has just been surreal and unbelievable in so many ways, that there has been so much violence and destruction and loss of life. It's very sobering and very disturbing and upsetting. And so I couldn't let this episode go by without mentioning it, because we are at a really important place in the evolution of our society where we really have to stop and take a look at what we're doing here, what's going on, and really try to understand why this is happening and why this violence and hatred is emerging in our society, and look within ourselves to see what we can do in our own way to try to bring more love and more positivity into our communities and into the world, more tolerance and acceptance and love. I'm not going to go much further into it than that, but I'll mention just a couple of the ideas I shared in the blog on how to cope when tragedy strikes. One is to give, and I think it's always helpful when we're suffering, and the majority of us have not experienced a direct loss of a loved one, I'm sure, in these mass shootings. So the majority of us are dealing with the trauma of witnessing such atrocity that has taken place, and witnessing it from a distance and feeling somewhat helpless about it. Those who live in the communities where these shootings have taken place at least can go to the site, they can bring flowers, they can participate in memorial services. The rest of us are more on the periphery of the event and suffering in our own ways and perhaps feeling isolated from it. So I think one of the things that can help us when we're wondering, what can I do, and feeling helpless, is simply to give. And while we may not be able to give directly to those who have been affected by the tragedies, at least giving in general is a helpful thing to do at a time like this. There are plenty of people suffering all around us in our own communities. And so dedicating ourselves for the next few weeks to trying to give something every day that can make life better for someone, I think it's a way to have a positive response to what's happening. It might include donating blood. I know that some of the communities have put out a call for blood donations for the survivors of the shooting who are still fighting for their lives. And so that's one way to give, but giving in general to anyone in your community or anyone around you who needs help, I think that's a good way to bring more positive energy and love into the world. So remember to give from the midst of your sorrow and from the midst of even your confusion and feeling devastated and helpless and despairing. Think of what you can give. What unique thing can you give and bring to the world during a time like this? The second suggestion is to pray, regardless of what religion you are, or if you have no religion, if you don't believe in God. The idea of prayer for me is to communicate with the higher energy, the creative power of the universe. If you don't believe that there's a God to pray to, prayer is a way of just opening your heart and communicating. And prayer is like using the energetic channels and network that connect us all to send love to people who need it. And that's how I view it. Prayer is a way of first, I fill myself with as much love as I can, and then use prayer to radiate it out and send it out to all of those who are in need of love and compassion and caring. So if you are a person of faith and you have a prayer tradition that you believe in, then by all means utilize that. If you've never prayed in your life and you don't believe in the idea of prayer, really you can simply sit and contemplate and think about the people who are suffering and imagine that you are sending them ripples of love and compassion and support that are traveling to them through the airwaves magically, and that will reach them and help them. Third, I suggest the idea of lighting a candle. And one thing that I have made a practice in my life, I purchased these, they're called sanctuary candles, tall glass candles that will burn for about 7 days continuously. And when something tragic happens in my own life or in the world around me, I have a tradition of taking a sanctuary candle, lighting it, and placing it in the window. And so that the light is burning constantly 24 hours a day. And it not only, it brings me some hope, because even from my bedroom, I can sometimes look out and see that candle flickering in the window in my living room. And I recognize that it's adding light to the darkness, and it's symbolic in many ways, but it gives me some comfort to see the light shining there. The fourth thing to do is to look within. And so I think rather than reacting with judgment and hatred and anger toward the perpetrators of violence, I think it's important that we each remember that as human beings, we are all capable of violent acts. Whether we realize it or not, and whether we see it within ourselves, we are all capable of violence. It's partly how we are wired and how we are built. We are animals in a certain extent, and we are capable of committing violence ourselves. And sometimes We commit violence on a day-to-day basis in different ways, not physical violence where we physically harm other people, but sometimes we have thoughts that do harm to others. Sometimes we say words, we gossip, or we tell stories about other people that are harmful. And sometimes we treat ourselves with violence. Sometimes we actually loathe ourselves and we think negative thoughts about ourselves. And so I think at a time like this, it's a good reminder to look within and understand how can I rid myself of the violence that I am putting out into the world or practicing in my day-to-day life without even recognizing it? How can I find it, and how can I heal my own inner violence and bring peace and love to myself within myself? Because that's one of the ways that we're going to help the world discover greater peace, is by finding it within ourselves. So I think that needs to become part of our daily practice, is recognizing I too have hatred within me. I too am capable of doing harmful things to other people. And I need to recognize that within my own shadow so that I don't let it get out of control inside of me and act out in ways that I don't see on a day-to-day basis. So look within is the fourth thing. And the last thing is to practice compassion. And I mean that intentionally, to spend a little time every day thinking about what does it mean to be compassionate toward other people, people who are different than me, people who believe different things than I do, people who live their lives in different ways than I do. Can I find room to feel tolerance and acceptance for them? And I'm including people who are perpetrators of violence, people who intentionally harm others. Can I find my way to compassion for them? Because compassion has to be applied to everyone in order to be authentic and to be real. We can't include some people in our compassionate behavior and exclude other people, because that isn't genuinely practicing love and compassion. So we have to find our way to exploring the boundaries of our own compassion and figuring out how we can expand it, and how can we include people that we currently reject or judge or have no tolerance for. And nowadays, I feel like our intolerance and non-acceptance and hatred are at peak levels right now throughout our society. And chances are we get caught up in that as well. We get angry at people who say hateful things, and we don't like them for saying that. But I'm suggesting that we need a practice where we expand our hearts and open our hearts to everyone, including the people that we don't like, including people who do and say things we don't like, who act in ways that seem heinous to us, that we find a way to have compassion even for those people. That's the only way that we're going to bring about healing in general in our society, is to expand our own capacity for compassion. So those were just some quick suggestions from this blog post I wrote so long ago about how to cope when tragedy strikes. I wanted to mention it and talk about it because these events are huge in our society, and we need to acknowledge them, and we need to talk about them, even when they're painful, even when they're confusing, even when we have no answers. We feel frustrated, we feel despair, we feel outrage. How could this be? How could it be that this happens now so frequently in our society? How is it happening? And in the midst of this helplessness, I wanted to emphasize that there are some things we can do. It may seem like these are the smallest, tiniest things that aren't really going to make a difference, but I believe it's a beginning and it's a start for how we can help to move our society in a more positive direction. And so that leads me directly into this series that I've been that I started last week, but that I am continuing today, the dance of life and death. This is part 2, balance. And so, if you think about it, balance is essential in a dance between two partners. Each partner has to find their own point of balance in order to take the steps they take and in order to move together. And the partners together have to be in balance with one another. And I think that's a really good metaphor for life and death. I talked about it last week, and I introduced you to some of the writings of Rainer Maria Rilke in letters of condolence that Rilke wrote to friends and loved ones who had experienced death and dying. And if you recall from last week, Rilke talked about how being introduced to death is our opportunity to finally become whole, that until we acknowledge death and embrace it as part of our lives, we are not really whole. And if you think about it, a couple dancing or a dancing person is not a whole couple, and if you can't see the partner the person is dancing with, if you ignore the partner. And so if we look only at life and ignore life's dancing partner, which is death, then we're not seeing the whole picture. And in fact, when we ignore death, we're actually limiting life to being a solo dancer and limiting how much of the dance life can participate in as a solo dancer versus a part of a whole, part of a couple and a pair. So when life is paired with death in this dance, life has the steady hand of death to allow life to dance to its full extent, to make lunges and leaps and twists and swirls that might not be possible alone, but life with death in hand is more stable and more secure in this dance that I'm talking about. So I hope this is making sense. If you think of the two partners, the give and take between them as they step toward and away from each other, as they're dancing, matching their steps, balancing their momentum, this is how life and death intertwine and work together. But the groundedness of death allows life a safe container within which to be fully expressed. And that's what I see in the dance when I see an amazing couple together doing incredible leaps and tosses in the air, and how their two bodies work together to produce this beautiful image of a dance. That's what I'm trying to apply to life and death and how they can work together. So, as I mentioned, I want to talk about this idea of the balance between life and death. Very often in our society, I think we're way out of balance. We focus on living, we love life, we focus on life, but we eliminate death from our perspective. We leave it out most of the time. We don't talk about it. We don't include it in our vision of life and our perspective. We don't plan for it, definitely, but we don't recognize the presence of death as it is perpetually, forever, throughout our lives, interwoven. We tend to ignore it and refuse to recognize it. And I have a couple of little stories to talk about. First is a woman named Julie. Julie was a friend of a friend who I was asked to pay some visits to, who was dying of pancreatic cancer. And Julie was a scientist who studied nutrition. She'd been involved in a lot of different research projects, and she actually had a paper that she was writing about a study that had been done when she got this diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, and it was very advanced and beyond the stage where any treatment would have helped. So I met with Julie a few times. In the beginning, I saw her frantically trying to get her paper written, desperately wanting to get it finished before she would die. And she was going through her desk, looking at all of her notebooks and papers and trying to decide, I have limited time. What should I focus my attention on? Also, she had some friends she wanted to visit. She had family members in Germany that she had been wanting to see for years and years, and had been putting off traveling there to see them. So I saw her go through this list of things, trying to figure out what's most important. She was still healthy enough and strong enough that she could travel. And I watched her as she struggled with this balance. What matters to me the most with limited time? What should I do? And ultimately, Julie decided to leave the paper because there were other people involved in the research who could actually finish that paper if she wasn't able to. And it would have taken all of her time to complete it. So she decided instead that she would travel to Germany. That became in her mind the most important thing that she could do. She ended up going to Germany, visiting her family members who lived there. And it completely exhausted her. It was very, very tiring, but it was also very worthwhile. And in the end, she was glad that she made that choice to visit her family and sacrifice the paper that she was writing. But when Julie got back from Germany and I went to see her to hear about her trip, she was noticeably weaker and more tired from her cancer. And Julie asked me the question, when do I stop living and start dying? And I thought about it, and my answer to her was, Julie, we are always doing both. From the moment we're born, we're always living and dying at the same time, all of us. It's just that we don't recognize the dying. We don't recognize that cells in our body are constantly dying and turning over. And we don't see how much every growth period we have, every time we move from one stage of development to another, something within us dies while something else replaces it and is born. And so I tried to tell her, Julie, we're doing both. Like, it's important to recognize both living and dying. And Julie didn't understand that. It made no sense to her. She said, no. Right now, all I want is to live. And all I think about every day is, how can I keep living? How can I keep living? But she said, I recognize that at some point, I'm going to have to turn my view toward dying, but I don't know when that is. And so I had to leave her with, the only thing I could say is, I believe that you will know when it's time, that you will know when it's time to turn your focus toward dying. And she rejected my idea that we're constantly living and dying at the same time. To her, it just didn't make sense. So a few weeks later, I went back to visit Julie, and she was sitting in her recliner at that time. She was very quiet and somber. There was no light left in her eyes and very little energy in her. And she said to me, now I'm dying. I'm no longer living. And it felt true to me. It felt that she had given up in some ways on living, and that to her it seemed necessary. She could no longer focus on trying to live longer. She needed to turn her attention to really focusing on dying and actually trying to die. She told me she wanted to die as quickly as possible to get it over with. And so in Julie's case, I really felt she was not able to embrace dying within her living experience. For her, they were two separate things that she had polarized, and they didn't go together for her, and she was not able to put them together. But I still believed that the ideal approach to our life is to balance living and dying together, and to be aware of dying at all times and when it's part of our lives. Even though my first experience of talking about it with someone, I wasn't able to inspire her with that idea of mine. And again, I haven't been in her position of having a terminal illness and having to face that. So I knew that perhaps I'm just naive in thinking that it's possible to feel fully alive even while you're dying and to be aware of dying even while you're healthy and living. I do know that's possible. The second is possible because that's how I live my life. I live my life with full awareness every day of death around me and within me. But I don't know the other half of it. I don't know what it's like to be dying from a terminal illness and working to continue to live. So a few years after Julie died, a good friend of mine, Mary Lou, reached a terminal stage of the breast cancer that she had been dealing with for the previous 7 years. And so Mary Lou had really exhausted all the possible treatments that were available to her. She had pursued a lot of alternative treatments as well, and her cancer continued to grow. So she was facing the fact that she probably was not going to recover from cancer this time around. And Mary Lou and I had had many different conversations about the spiritual aspect of cancer and the dying process. So we were used to having deep conversations about this. And I told Mary Lou about the conversation I had had with Julie. I told her that a woman I worked with had asked me, when do I stop living and start dying? And Mary Lou, and I told Mary Lou that it was my belief that we're always doing both at all times, that we're dying even while we're living, and we can be living even when we're dying. And Mary Lou agreed with me in philosophy. She agreed that that was the ideal and told me that that's how she wanted her last years or months of life to be. She wanted to be living until the very end, but aware of the fact that she's dying at the same time and had been dying all throughout her life, as I was saying. But Mary Lou later told me of her last visit to her oncologist's office. And she told me that when she discussed with the oncologist that she wanted to stop all treatment and that she had recognized that the treatment wasn't helping anymore. It was basically causing side effects, and she didn't want to spend her last months of life experiencing the side effects. The oncologist said to her, well, then you have no need for me anymore. He said, I'm here to help you focus on living. And if you're not willing to focus on that anymore, then I don't belong in your life. You don't need to see me anymore. If you just want to focus on dying, that's up to you, but I'm not going to be part of that. So that story from Mary Lou really brought home to me how much our medical profession, the profession to which I belong, perpetuates this idea that living and dying are two completely different tracks, and you can be on one or the other, but they don't connect. And I really feel that that is a misguided perception and belief about death and dying. And in addition, it was so harmful to Mary Lou. And I know that many other patients experience the same thing. They've been basically rejected by their doctors when they have said they don't want to pursue treatment any longer. Basically, Mary Lou was shamed by the doctor and then abandoned. And she was distraught when I talked to her because she'd been seeing the same doctor for 7 years. She'd been going to the same office. She knew all the people who worked at the front desk. She knew all the clinic assistants. She loved the office space itself, just visiting there, the pictures on the walls, the ambiance of the clinic. And these people and this clinic had been such an important part of her life for 7 years. And suddenly, when she had decided that she needed to make more room for dying and to stop clinging to the desperate hope that she would live longer, but allow dying to be present within her life, she got rejected by the very people who had been helping her so much for all these years. And she was really devastated. It hurt her deeply. So I started coming to visit her more often. I was not her doctor. I was not providing care for her in that regard. I was her friend. So she had a hospice team there, but I was not a member of that hospice team. I was coming to visit her as a friend. But I understood that my being a doctor was somewhat healing for her because she still felt connected in some ways to the medical profession, and she still felt as if there was a medical provider who understood her and cared about her through me being there. But watching Mary Lou suffer that rejection was a powerful experience for me, and to realize how our rational medical system is just not helpful for patients as they're struggling with this balance, the dance between life and death. How do I keep living while I'm dying? How do I acknowledge that I'm dying even when I'm living? How do I experience both of those together, moment to moment in my life? So that search became important for Mary Lou for the rest of her days. As her energy waned and as she became less and less able to do things physically for herself, she struggled with this idea of, what does it take to live fully even when I can't physically do the things I used to do, that I used to consider an essential part of living, of my life. Now that I'm letting go of them and leaving them behind, how do I still feel alive every moment in every day, even as I'm watching my body gradually die and dissolve away? So I had this rare privilege of sitting with Mary Lou many days during her last weeks of life and observing the process she was going through. And in contrast to Julie, who became very dark and very negative and sad during her last days of life, Mary Lou became more and more joyful and grateful and filled with love and light every single moment of the last days of her life. And I remember the last time I saw her, a few days before she died, she whispered to me, "I'm just dissolving away. I'm dissolving, and all that's left of me is the love." And she said to me, "I'm not scared. Is it okay that I'm not scared? And I'm not sad?" And I said, "That's perfect, Mary Lou. That's perfect." And so Mary Lou was the beautiful example that I had wondered if it was possible to live fully every moment until your very last breath. And Mary Lou was an example for me that it is indeed possible. I saw it and I experienced it at the bedside with her. So that's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. And I called this discussion balance because we are out of balance. And it's so important that we find the balance again between the two partners, life and death. We each have to work on it in our own lives. Our society is horribly out of balance, and we are going to struggle to bring our society back into balance if we ourselves are not in balance. And I will tell you, I have seen it many times in all of my work with other people, professionals working in hospice, that even those of us who work with the dying all the time, who've dedicated our lives to helping people in their own dying process, to teaching people about death and dying, even those of us doing the work every day are sometimes out of balance in our own personal lives. Sometimes the reason we work with other people and help them with their dying process is because we don't want to look at it in our own lives. We don't want to experience our own dying. And we project outward to other people. We engage ourselves and distract ourselves by being involved in other people's journeys and paths so that we don't have to look at our own discomfort with death and dying. So one of the reasons I keep talking about this is because it's important for all of us to get ourselves in balance and to make sure that our perspectives on life and death are balanced, and that the way we live our lives reflects the balance that we have achieved between life and death in our own lives. So every day, I believe we have to be aware of this balance between life and death and make sure that we're honoring it and embracing it and facing up to it and looking at it and not allowing our fear of the unknown or even our fear of the known. Because if you work with death and dying long enough, you're likely to have seen some negative experiences happen. And so it can be our fear of knowing what can happen on the negative side of things that can cause us to deflect away our own thoughts of our own death and dying and not process it. But I really want to encourage all of us to do our own work at trying to be in balance with our perspectives on life and death and this dance. One of the reasons I think it's so important for us to acknowledge death, and really, I think I've talked in some other episodes about this notion of carrying death on my shoulder so that death is with me at all times, and I constantly think about it, is that death helps us let go of our attachments to things. And if you're familiar at all with Buddhism, you know that one of the tenets of Buddhism is that attachment is the root of suffering. We suffer because we get attached to things being a certain way. And when change happens, we suffer disappointment and pain and feelings of abandonment because of the change. But it was really our attachment that determines how much we suffer. The more attached we are, the more pain we feel when we lose the thing that we were attached to. So remembering death at all times helps us reduce our attachments to things, because we're constantly remembering, like, everything changes, everything dies ultimately. And so I have to be prepared for that. I have to know that the things I love and care about are going to dissolve away and are going to leave me at some point. The people that I love and care about, they're going to go away in one way or another. I will lose my relationships. I will lose the things that I'm in love with right now. And I can keep being in love with them and love them as deeply as possible, but I have to know that everything changes and everything dies ultimately, and loss happens. When I keep that awareness in my mind, I can still love deeply, but I'm loving in a non-attached way. So I'm loving while knowing that I can go on even if I lose the things I love, and I will continue on. So it's this non-attached loving and joy that helps us cope the best and stay the healthiest, both mentally and spiritually and even physically in our lives, if we can reduce our attachment to things. And being aware of death is one of the best ways I've experienced of reducing our attachments. And when we're not so attached, we can cope with and negotiate suffering and change more easily, because we get used to being in the flow and being in balance and keeping our emotions in balance. So one thing that happens when you let go of attachments is that you're less likely to feel euphoria when something good happens. You're less likely to get carried away to such a high state of positive emotion that you're, way up in the clouds. because getting that euphoric usually results in crashing back down to the earth a short time later when the reality of the situation comes true. And also, you're less likely to be devastated when things that you interpret as negative or bad happen. And so if you listened last week, I told a little story about, for me, being totally attached to the idea of becoming a doctor and getting into medical school. And that the first year I applied, I didn't get into medical school. And I was devastated and bitter and resentful for quite a long time after that disappointment of not getting into medical school the first year I applied. That's because I had been so attached for so many years to that goal and to the outcome. And it had never occurred to me that it possibly wouldn't happen or wouldn't come true. Now it did ultimately, of course, a year later, as I described in the story, but it was my attachment to that goal that caused me to experience so much pain when the goal wasn't completed, when the outcome wasn't what I desired. So letting go of these strong attachments is one of the best ways we can have of maintaining equanimity in our lives, of taking things a little more lightly and not having such huge expectations for positive things that might happen, and not having such huge worries about so-called negative things that might happen. So again, I wanted to reiterate that story to emphasize that being aware of death and the fact that all things die ultimately is the thing that has helped me the most to reduce those attachments that I tend to form, that we all tend to form. So that's one of the reasons I think it's so important that we recognize death as the eternal dance partner of life, and welcome death into our lives, and welcome what death can do and teach us about life. So I have a couple of ideas of some little practices if you would like to bring more death awareness into your daily life. The first thing that I recommend is a morning practice every day when you wake up, to start by thinking, hey, I'm still here. And recognize that each day of life is really a gift. Remember that there's probably someone not too far away from you who didn't wake up this morning, who's not here today, who didn't get one more day. There's also someone not too far away from you for whom today is their last day of life. Someone will take their last breath today, and that someone's probably not that far away from you. Death is all around you. And if each day you can acknowledge, wow, I'm still here, I made it, one more day, who knows what will happen today, but I'm still here and I'm still breathing, so that you start the day with a sense of gratitude just for being alive, just the fact that you're still here and you made it through the night. So that's a good morning practice. And again, have an awareness as you're feeling grateful for your life, with respect and awareness and honor that other people did not wake up today as you did, and honor the fact that others have experienced their last day already and are not here to wake up this morning. And then in addition to that, as a second practice, throughout the day, if you can, whenever you can, remember this little mantra to yourself: this day is a gift. If you begin to see each day that you do wake up, each day that you get to be alive, it's a gift that you've received. And so throughout the day, no matter what's happening, whether you feel frustrated or upset about something going on, stop for just a moment and recall this day is a gift, and approach every moment of your day with that same attitude of gratitude and being grateful that you received the gift that you did of life today. And it doesn't matter if it's a wonderful day or a frustrating day or a tragic day, you are still here. This is the gift that you've received, is to be here today. The third thing is to notice death around you. As I said, death is around us all the time. Death is within us at all times. But tune in your awareness to begin to notice death around you. I particularly do this in nature because I try to go for walks outside almost every day if I can. So I spend time in nature. I've noticed a tree that's dying in my yard that I walked by today. I like watching the wildflowers throughout the summer and how they bloom and then die out later in the summer. So they go from being beautiful colored blossoms to drying up and blowing away in the wind, and even the stems become dry as they die out and then get trampled later on in the season. Just observing the natural cycle of life and death, how it's visible all around us. But that's where also observing what's happening in our world is important, and where contemplating tragedies like the mass shootings that we have experienced recently can be helpful as well. To contemplate the fact that life is fleeting and anything can happen at any time. None of us has any guarantee of being here. None of those people who died in those shootings expected to die that day or had any clue that they would die when they went to the store to do their shopping. None of them had any idea that life was going to end for them that day. And so being a witness to these tragedies and to death as it occurs all around us is a powerful reminder to us of the preciousness of every moment of life, a reminder again to stay in that state of gratitude. This day is a gift. This moment is a gift. This breath I'm breathing right now is a gift, all of it. And I need to be thankful in every moment for each moment that I have, whether it's something's happening that I'm happy about and thrilled about, or something's happening that I'm disappointed with, I'm still grateful that I get to experience it. So in this way, I think contemplating tragedy when it happens around us, and all you have to do is open a newspaper, read a few posts on Facebook, you will see it all around you. You'll become aware of the presence of death all around you, and you can contemplate it and experience gratitude for your own life, experience compassion and love for those who are suffering right now because of the death of someone they love. Experience also love, compassion, mercy, and grace for those who have died and for those who are on their journey after life, whatever that might consist of. The next practice is to honor the little deaths that happen every day. And that's something else I've read I believe it was in Sogyal Rinpoche's book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, talking about how we can use the little deaths that occur in our own lives as a way of practicing for our own death when it ultimately comes. And acknowledging, first of all, that our own lives are filled with little deaths. I mentioned this already as through our stages of development. You know, when a child starts walking and gives up crawling, that's like a little death, because whatever joys were obtained from crawling are lost in this experience of walking. And even though it's a positive change and positive growth, there's still a little death in giving up what was before. So just think about all of the little deaths that there are that we experience in our lives. And here's just a few for me. One is I just found out that a person that I've been working with, who was part of an organization that I'm dealing with, is leaving her job. And so she will no longer be my contact person with that organization. And I've gotten to know her over the last couple of years and really enjoy our emails and our conversations with one another. But she's leaving her job. She won't be the person I'll talk to anymore. I have to get to know someone new. That person might have different ideas and want to move in different directions than she did. And so that's a little death. That relationship has changed. I don't know if this woman and I will stay in contact, if I will ever have a conversation with her or send an email back and forth with her again, because our connection was just work related. So her leaving her job, which is a good thing for her because she's moving on in her life and exploring new paths and new creative work, which is fantastic. But it is a little death, one of those little losses that occurs in life. So something that I'm acknowledging within myself as there it is, there's another sign, another example of a little death coming along my way. And I mentioned the fact that I saw a tree that's dying in our yard. It's right next to a little stream that happens to run through our yard. And somehow that tree didn't make it through this past winter, and it's been slowly and gradually dying all summer long. And I've watched the needles of the tree turning brown more and more and more throughout the tree, and ultimately it's going to be fully gone in the next few months. And so that's a loss because it's been a beautiful tree to look at. It's in a really nice spot. It adds some shade there, and it's a lovely tree, but its life cycle is coming to an end. And so that's another little death. Another thing is having this favorite pair of pants that I love to wear, that I've been wearing for years actually, and the fabric has gotten so worn that they actually just like ripped completely through in multiple places, and I had to realize, like, I can't wear these anymore. They're beyond repair. I can't wear them anymore. I have to let them go. That's a tiny little death. It seems silly in some ways, and yet it's just a reminder that everything that we have right now will wear out one day. Nothing lasts. Everything changes, and it's a little type of a death and a little way of practicing letting go. Now I will move on from those favorite pants that I love to wear, and something else, I'll find something else to replace them. But it's a tiny little death, and I'm practicing letting go. And one more example, a favorite restaurant that I love to go to for breakfasts also closed down. And this restaurant just had a unique menu. I love taking friends and family there to eat. We had so many memories of really fun meals at this restaurant, and it has closed and never to open again. The owner just decided she was tired of it and didn't want to run the business anymore. So it's gone. And so just like that, the restaurant's gone, the building shut down, some other business moved into that space, and that was another little death. So those were just a few examples of the changes in our lives that come. They're little deaths, little opportunities for us to practice letting go of our attachments, letting go of our expectations, and our clinging to how things should be, how we want things to be, how we think they ought to be, and letting go to let life be what it is, and to make room for death in all of its forms and manifestations. So the last step of all of this is to remember, I'm emphasizing the importance of being in balance. And I once had a yoga teacher explain, because yoga, if you've done it, has several poses that rely on balance. In fact, most of the poses require a certain amount of balance in order to hold the pose. But there are some poses where you balance on one leg. And so you have to work very hard on developing your strength and learning how to balance your own weight over one leg in different poses so that you can stay there and hold that pose without falling over. But the yoga teacher mentioned The reason that we practice balance poses is not so that we can one day be in perfect balance at all times. It's so that we can learn how to get back into balance when we fall out of balance. And I really love that. I love the idea that it's a normal part of the whole process to fall out of balance. In fact, that's what life is, a continuous process of falling out of balance over and over again and getting back into balance. So all of our practice that we do is practice to get better and better at getting back into balance. So we don't even cling to this expectation that one day I'm going to be perfectly balanced in all ways. No, we allow ourselves the room and the space to constantly fall out of balance and practice getting back into it. So that's one reminder I wanted to make in general about achieving balance in all of our lives, but also this balance between our awareness of life and death, of living and dying. It's a practice to learn how to bring ourselves back into balance when we have fallen out. So I do believe that if we have spent our lives working on integrating life and death, on intertwining them in this dance that we're doing, that when we reach our final days, it will be easier for us to keep living when it is time for us to die, which is what happened with my friend Mary Lou. And I believe that each one of us can achieve that. And one of the reasons I'm practicing getting back into balance in my life now on a daily basis is so that it will be easier for me when I reach my final weeks and days of life to find the balance again, to get back in the balance and to remember to keep living even when I'm dying. And I believe that what living fully consists of, as the body is fading away and dissolving, as Mary Lou said, what fully being alive means is to experience love and to become love, which is the one thing that doesn't dissolve, that doesn't disappear, that doesn't die. So I believe if we continue practicing, recognizing death in our lives, practicing with gratitude every day that we have this opportunity to be here, we can maximize our love and compassion for ourselves, for other people, for our planet. And we can get better and better at staying in balance as we open our hearts, bring in all of the rejected and the unloved of the world, and find love and compassion for all of that within our own hearts. And without throwing ourselves off balance, we can stay in our place of balance. We can continue to embrace death within our lives. We continue to experience gratitude and love and compassion and joy that we have this life, joy that we woke up this morning and that we get one more chance to be here, one more cycle, one more rotation of the earth today. So I believe that it's possible for us at the very end of life, when we take our last breaths, to still be experiencing joie de vivre, the joy of being alive, as the French say, the joy of having had a life, the joy of having had the opportunity to be here, the joy of the gift of being alive in the midst of death, and the gift of dancing together, two partners, life and death. And as we contemplate the tragedies that have occurred in the world around us, and many tragedies we don't even hear about and don't even know about that are going on continuously all around the world, that we can remain in a place of balance as much as possible and recognize death as part of life and life as part of death. Hold on and keep loving, keep being grateful for the gift of life, and keep opening our hearts. And so that concludes part 2 of The Dance of Life and Death, Balance. And as I get ready to say goodbye, I will remind you once again of the Patreon page, patreon.com/EOLU, if you'd like to support this podcast. Also, tell other people about it if you think they'd be interested. And leave a review on iTunes if you enjoy this content as well. I did want to do a favor for my friend Emily Cross and let you know that she and Jill Shook are going to be teaching a workshop, a retreat actually, called A Deeper Dive into Death, October 18th through 20th at a hot springs resort in California. There's going to be a link in the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com if you want to check out A Deeper Dive into Death at a hot springs resort, which sounds amazing, in October. And then hopefully I'll see some of you in New York City in September at the Open Center. So tune in next week for another new episode. And until then, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings your way. And love every moment of your life. It is truly a gift. Bye-bye.